talking about the deficit, the deficit, the deficit, and meanwhile the unemployment crisis and the foreclosure crisis are fading into the national consciousness, fading away from our focus. Now I want to lay a baseline of reality about this budget deficit, and these are things that I think should be screamed from the front pages of every newspaper every day. If Congress does nothing at all, then by 2014, the deficit will be reduced by 67%. If Congress does nothing at all, by 2017, we get to what's known as primary balance. That means that the amount of outflows will equal the amount of inflows. The only difference will be the deficit, the interest paid on the outstanding debt. So if we do nothing at all, by 2017 we get basically to a balanced budget. That's a baseline of reality, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Now we know that the media has shifted its attention to the deficit, and I want to just read a few of the words that they're using. If nothing happens, then the deficit will decrease by 2/3 over the next 3 years. But the Washington Post told its readers in a front-page news story that Democrats and Republicans have, quote, been lambasted as being far too timid in dealing with this nation's swelling budget deficit. The New York Times talked about America's own, quote, ballooning deficit. The Washington Post, in another one, called it the, quote, spiraling debt. Again, we have a baseline of reality. And it's that we have a downward slope from the deficit. Now I want to talk about what this means. What is a deficit? What is a budget deficit? In my life, it means that I don't have enough money to buy the things that I want to buy. I want to buy a car, it costs $15,000, I have 10. That's a deficit. So we're told all the time that we have this structural economic issue called the budget deficit. It's structural, it's baked in the cake. It's not just a matter of Congress not raising enough taxes to cover its spending. It's some sort of esoteric reality, something that grows like a mushroom, organically. So I want to look at this idea that we have a structural economic problem called a deficit. But first I want to ask you to consider what thinking about it as a structural economic problem leads us to. We're having a debate right now about this very, very difficult negotiation over raising the debt ceiling. And what the budget deficit is being used to do is to justify dramatic spending cuts. Now in theory, you could close a deficit by raising revenues as well. But that's not what we're talking about. So this focus, this relentless focus on a budget deficit, on this structural economic problem, is leading us to very severe, painful, deep cuts. And we're talking about privatizing Medicare. We're talking about changing the Medicaid system to block grants. We're talking about a lot of cuts that will hurt real people, real vulnerable people. An analysis of the Ryan budget plan found that 70% of those cuts fell on society's most vulnerable people. So by thinking about it as a structural economic problem called the budget deficit, it leads us to some inherently, I would argue, conservative approaches to public policy. So I want to just take a few minutes and think about some other ways that one might think about the budget deficit. Now I would say that we do indeed have a structural economic problem called the budget deficit if we were spending profligately. Is that a word? Is that a word? Okay. The referees like profligately. If you look before the crash, in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, this is the rich countries club, the other developed, highly developed nations. If you look between 2004 and 2007, before the crash, we ranked 24th out of 26 countries for which data was available for all those years. 24th out of 26th. In terms of our spending, we were 7 percentage points of GDP, remember how big our economy is, that's real money, below the average. 7 percentage points below the average. Now, I would also think that we have a structural economic problem if we were, as many Americans believe, taxed to death. Tea Party, it stands for taxed enough already. In 2008, we ranked 26th out of 30 OECD countries in terms of our overall tax burden. 26th out of 30. In terms of our tax burden, we were 9 percentage points below the average. And if you looked at the difference between 7 percentage points below on the spending side and 9 percentage points below on the tax side, well, there's your budget deficit, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not done. Oh, I'm not done. Sorry. I got just 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. So, that's not the whole story, however, because of course in many developed countries with their tax bill, they also get free health care, they get university tuition, deeply subsidized, etc., etc. But I want you to just to think for a moment, consider for a moment what kind of other approaches we might take if we looked at other ways of conceptualizing this fiscal picture. Now, in the last 3 years, including this year, 2009, 2010, 2011, the federal government is going to collect the least amount of revenues as a share of the economy since 1950. 61 years, before we had Medicare. Before we had Medicare. So, when you look at that, you can say, we don't have a structural economic problem. We're not taxed to death. We're not spending a lot. We have a revenue problem. We have very, very low revenues, the lowest revenues that we've had in 61 years. And that would lead us to a different approach for dealing with the fiscal picture, wouldn't it? Now, I mentioned that in Europe, when they spend a little bit more, in Europe, the other developed countries, when they spend more on their tax burden, they get more for it. You get health care. There are 35 countries with longer average life expectancies than the United States today. 35 countries. And if you take what they spend, what any one of them spends per person on health care, and then you plug it into the US federal budget projections, what you get is not a balanced budget in a few years. You get hefty surpluses starting in about 2016, 2017. So if you conceive of that as a healthcare cost crisis, well, that leads you to a different approach to the fiscal picture. There's an economist who I cite in my book named Robert Higgs. Robert Higgs went back and he tried to figure out what share of our public debt outstanding, which is running about $14 trillion right now, can be attributed to past defense spending. So he went back and he said, okay, I'm going to go back to when we were running basically zero deficits, close to it. I think he went to 1916 was his baseline. And then what he did was he just simply added up a prorated share of all the deficits between then and now, and attributed that prorated share that went to defense spending. And what he found, ladies and gentlemen, is that 91% of our public debt can be attributed to past defense spending. 91%. We are still paying for World War II. We are still paying for Korea. We are still paying for Vietnam. We are still paying for Grenada. And the amount of the gap in Medicare that we're told is this dire, pressing crisis that has to be addressed right now is equal to 1/5 of the increase in defense spending since 9/11. And that won't hit us until 2024. So if you think about it as an unsustainable overseas empire problem, well, I would say that that naturally leads to a different approach. In all of these things, we've found a very different approach depending on how we conceptualize the problem. Now, in my book, I talk a lot about how we've ended up looking at these inherently conservative narratives across the political spectrum, and that's something that we can talk about in the Q&A. But before I leave it, I just want everybody to consider, for a moment, a very simple question. And that question is this: what would we be looking at if Washington, if the DC press corps, if our politicians were spending the same amount of energy, the same amount of focus on the jobs crisis, on the foreclosure crisis, as they're spending with this largely trumped up deficit crisis?